Welcome to the podium that you followed our invitation for a discussion on housing, and not on housing in the sense which is very often discussed from the social point of view. This is one side, but our aim was to bring into the discussion the economic situation of housing. What we wanted to contribute to the economic questions which are linked with the housing markets. And having in Austria a relatively big market share of limited profit housing, it's not social housing and it's not free market housing. It's housing on a cost-based organized. And with 40% market share, it's a real player on the market. And so we thought it would be interesting to ask the questions to what is following out for the market in this situation. And this is 40% in stock. And in new construction, if you look at new construction, it's even higher, 50 to 60% of new construction. So this was the idea, to deepen the economic analysis in this way with the conference today. And well, just directly, thank you. Yeah. And just a few remarks before the experts start. Perhaps it's better like that. Something we hear now, yeah? We are used to two different forms of pricing in our discussion in general. It's social housing. We don't speak of investment costs, we speak of pricing, which is has to be in contact with the income situation of the household. And on the other hand, it's ironically, you could say it's the same. They are all as well looking at the income situation of the household. This is a free market pricing. They try to get out as much as possible of the households. This is this is the normal market situation, and competition, we all are searching for competition, should bring the price down to a cost niveau. Actually, it doesn't happen, perhaps in some countries, but not in Europe and in the US. Perhaps in other countries they succeed having a functioning market which is bringing down the cost, the prices near to a cost level. And these are the questions which were in our interest. What is happening here? Because if you have speculative pricing, we were just talking before of the good influence of trickling down effects, and smiling a bit, but it's a sad smile. There is a trickling down effect if the prices go up and the house prices go up, and the higher income households are just able to afford it. The profit goes down, is trickling down to landowners, to material producers, to developers, and so on. So we need competition and hope that we find solutions. We discuss in politics how is housing affected of politics, bad zoning, too long work in regulations, different regulations. We should discuss how is housing affected by behavior of the investors and how we can shape it. It's tradition to shape a capital market. It's tradition to shape an energy market, and it's not tradition to shape a housing market in an active discussion. We do it without knowing sometimes, but to have a good way, and if we have a good shaping, then we can speak about not reached social needs, and so on. But before the economic situation is how do we come to a good economic basis. But I'm just here to say hello to you. That was already too long, and I pass over, and I'm very happy that Soka Edwards, General Secretary of Housing Europe, leads us through the afternoon. Very welcome, and thank you very much.
Thanks. So I was also very happy with the invitation to be here, especially because this study and the studies that will be presented today come at a very crucial time for Europeans. So we have just published our State of the Housing Report, which we publish every 2 years, and it's not a pretty picture in Europe for European citizens when it comes to affordability of housing. So that's why we need policymakers to come together right now with clever, good ideas, learning from what is working, learning from what has worked over a long period, and really bringing together that knowledge so that other cities that are struggling, other countries that are struggling, people that are struggling can benefit from this experience that we have heard about just now from Bernd, and that we heard about over the last 2 days indeed, because we have heard many examples of the success of the limited profit coupled with the municipal housing sector here in Vienna and across Austria. So thank you very much for this timely contribution to a debate that is really at the heart of many of the worries of many Europeans right now. And thank you again for bringing together such a team of experts, because I think together the entities that are around the table today, and of course you here in the room, I think we can really come up with some new thinking, with some new solutions to feed into the policy-making circles at city level, at national level, but also European level. Just today in the European Parliament, hosted by the Urban Affairs Committee there in Brussels, where our president is there, we have many cities coming together explaining how students have come back to study and have no affordable accommodation, how there's no possibility to house migrants coming from Ukraine. So this has become quite a political issue also at European level. So cities coming, looking for answers. And we all know this is a local competence, it's a national competence. But what type of answers could we give also from European level? I think it's also what we have to discuss today. And even if it boils down to exchange of those examples that work, I think that's already a good way forward. So let me introduce, so I have to, for a lesson for all of us, so we have to be near either that red microphone or this, and we have to use this, so we are double mic'd in a way. So if we want to drop the mic, it's complicated. So I think, as I say, really great panel from influential players in the housing sphere, which makes for a good discussion. So I'll introduce quickly, maybe I'll go back in time a little bit, because we heard from Bernd Piesland, and he's now scientific advisor for the Austrian Federation of Limited Profit Housing Associations, so GBV. So obviously a lot of different experience in the financial world and the housing world, and former president also of GBV. We will also welcome at the panel Michael Klien, so senior economist of the Austrian Institute of Economic Research. Very happy to have you here today. You're going to obviously present the key study that today is revolving around. Coming studies from Vienna University of Economics and Business, and worked as a postdoctoral researcher in the IAE in Paris. So already an international exposure. And I think this is crucial as well. So the Austrian representative in the Euroconstruct network. So one of the key sources of data guiding policymakers when it comes to the construction sector in Europe. And we also welcome Julie Lawson. So we've worked very closely together with Julie, one of the leading authors of the Housing 2030 report. So the Housing 2030 report is bringing together, indeed, best practice when it comes to housing, not only in the EU, but also in the UNSCE region, and she's an adjunct professor at the Centre of Urban Research, or MIT, in Australia, based in Australia. We will also have Stefan Zeugner, Deputy Head of Unit for Macroeconomic Imbalances at the European Commission, so DG ECFIN. And we also welcome from the OECD, so an entity that's growing influence in the housing sphere. Volker Ziemann is economist in the OECD's economics department. So I think together we have some key voices around the table. And I think we're well placed to bring some new ideas and new inspiration into the housing debate. So we're going to welcome, first of all, Michael Klien from WIFO, Austria. And I welcome you to join us here, or, yeah, if this suits you, that's fine. So just stay close to the two.
Okay.
Yes.
So thanks a lot, and for the opportunity to start this wonderful session here this afternoon. I'm pretty sure you've heard a lot about Austria and Vienna, and that the system is working as you framed it. That is true. I will try to shed a bit a light on why it is working, or which are the mechanisms actually that help the Austrian housing system, or the Viennese housing system maybe in particular, to make it work. So No. I was just not prepared to. Ich glaube, es startet. Maybe I'm a bit too quick, but
You need to enable the notifications and then.
so while Gerard is helping me, maybe a few words about the study that I'm going to present. So actually, it's part of a bigger project that we were following over the last years. It was together with people from the housing association network, and we were looking at two different aspects. And the second study is what I'm going to present today, because it actually deals with the question here on top, and the question that is actually present in all major cities around the world. How to dampen the housing cost in the private for-profit segment of the housing market. I mean, here we talk about social housing, and we're very happy about it, and we like it, and the rents they charge are affordable to a large extent. But actually, or what is producing the problems, or what hurts the housing markets and the households, is actually what is happening in the private for-profit market. So in this study, we are actually looking on, or the star of our research is the private for-profit market, actually. So we are not actually looking, or we are also looking at social or non-profit or limited profit housing in Austria. But what we want to find is actually solutions for the private for-profit market. This is the motivation behind our approach here. I mean, not only in Austria, but what are the typical recommendations or policies that are being tried? I mean, I'm an economist, and we learn at university that supply-side policies, increasing supply, is the best way to deal with a shortfall in supply or too high cost. Okay. I mean, this is tried all over the world with limited or mixed success, I would say. Over the past few years, we have entered a stage, I think, where more and more countries are experimenting with more direct regulatory approaches. We see now in Austria, but also in Germany or other countries around the world, rent caps or rent breaks are being tested, as a way to bring down the increases or the high level in the for-profit market rate housing sectors. And then, if you go even further, the discussion, at least to some extent in Germany, whether there should be expropriation or buybacks of private housing stock and bring it back to the public sector. So there are a lot of policies being discussed, and looking at what works in the Austrian housing sector, and what we are analyzing here is actually, if you think about Austria, you should think about a system where we have a special variation of a supply side policy. So, but this is not private for-profit market supply, but the policies are boosting or helping non-profit. I call it in the study here non-profit. We can have lengthy discussions about the right denominations for this, limited profit or social housing or whatever. But the key player here in Austria is supply changes or increases by non-profit housing segment. This is what is, I think, explaining a lot of the felt and told about success of the Austrian housing system. As I said, we had this bigger project and we split it in two. So we wanted in the first study to look at what are the direct effects or advantages of this system. There we focused more on the tenants in social or non-profit housing, how much money they can economize on compared to market rate housing, how this is helping the economy also. So not only focusing on the tenants, but also how investment consumption, how this feeds into the economy, and whether this is a good investment for the government. But here, and again, this relates to the question above, is there an indirect effect, or how large is this indirect effect that actually the supply of non-profit housing has on the for-profit segment in a local housing market? Yes, as an economist, this seems like a more elegant solution to the problem than more direct interventionist approaches like expropriation of some housing stock. So it seemed appealing at the outset to investigate this question, but there was no proof of such an effect or a quantification of such spillover effects from non-profit housing on the for-profit rental market. So this is in a picture what we tried to look at, and Bernd named the important term. So it's about competition between the two segments. So if there is no interaction, if they're completely segregated, then we could not hope to have an effect of the non-profit segment on the for-profit segment. But we discussed a lot, and we see it in the markets that there is interaction between these two segments. And we want to tease out actually what's the effect, because non-profits are cheaper than for-profits. Okay, but if we increase the share of non-profits in a local housing market, is it possible to bring down the market average and also the for-profit rents in this housing market? That is what we try to tease out in this study. I will skip this slide, but it was a lot of data cleaning and gathering. Let me assure you of that. Just why we did it, to help you understand the results. Quality is an important factor because, contrary to what you might believe, the private rental market is not providing luxury housing or luxury rental housing. This exists for sure, but this is not what we see in general. So if we take quality into account, actually the for-profit sector becomes even more expensive in comparison to the non-profit segment. And in our study, we always use the cost-based rent measures from the non-profit segment as the reference point to understand, okay, how large is the markup that for-profit landlords can actually demand over what costs would make necessary. So these are two important parts of our approach. So I will not spend a lot of time on this slide either, but the social housing segment is an important part and a growing supply segment in Austria. This is important for our empirical approach. Not so much in the aggregate, but I don't have it here. But we have regional variation in Austria, and this is how we econometrically try to identify the effects. Because in different regions in Austria, we have very different exposures to non-profit housing associations. So and we see changes in the shares in these regions over time. So this is what we are using to understand or to measure what is the effect of having more non-profit housing in a local housing market. It increased a lot because we take a long-term view, actually over several decades, where most of the analysis starts then from here, where we see steep increases in the share. Here we see the share with the red dashed line of social housing on aggregate, but we see on the regional level very different patterns. So we have some or hopefully enough variation to understand what's going on. I mentioned quality. As I said, if you look back a bit further, it might come to you as a surprise, or maybe not. People working in the system, they tell me everyone knew all along, but at least for me it was surprising to see that the private sector has older buildings on average. This is typically flats which are owned maybe for the first time, but are then rented out when the owners move on to a new apartment of a new construction. So what we see is historically it's really very different. We see that the private rent, the green line, the majority of them had no toilet in the apartment. So I mean there was a quality upgrading, a very steep one, but still we see that the types of housing or the qualities provided were on average higher, both in the community rental but also in the non-profit housing segment. So this is important to keep in mind when we do comparisons, just to compare apples and apples. One thing I will talk about a bit more is in the conclusions is actually boom bust. This is also an important feature that if you compare the different segments over time, how they set rents, and market rent is set at the market, and here we have boom bust cycles where you can see here, this is all for Vienna, the three different segments differentiated by building year. We do this because on the older buildings there are rent regulations, and so just to be sure to not confound our analysis by something. But you see in the 90s we had a construction boom in Vienna. You can see it in the market rents, how they increased, and then in the years after, actually the bust, you see the trends. They did not decrease nominally, but over time with inflation, the value of these rents decreased for quite some time. And now the cycle now is longer, at least the boom phase. So we have 15 years now of increasing rents also in Vienna in the private segment. And importantly, we see more or less flat rental, or at least not dictated by boom bust or by market, what's happening on the market in the non-profit rental sector or in the community housing. Yeah. This is not quality adjusted, but actually if we take into account the construction period of the building, this washes out most of the quality differences. Because what we saw previously, the buildings where we don't have a toilet are mostly, in the private segment, are mostly those built before end of Second World War or so. But even if you redo this graph with quality adjustments that we have, it looks virtually the same. you see the quality difference is actually in the lower rent levels for the older buildings, where the new construction is always the most important one when they enter the market, until newer buildings enter again. Okay. So yeah, this was the slide I was looking for before. So what is important in our story is that on the regional level we have an overall growing trend of non-profit housing across Austria over the last decades, but in some regions we had decreases in the share of compared to the private for-profit housing. Yes. So this gives us variation over time to understand how an increase in the share of non-profit housing can dampen the markups of the private for-profit landlords. And here you see how the market shares changes. Actually, this is also dependent on boom-bust phases. So what we have experienced in Vienna over the last 10 years was a boom phase, and the private segment was doing a lot of construction, much more than the non-profit housing associations. And in those phases, the share of for-profit rents increases, but typically in phases when there is a bust, the share of the for-profit segment goes down. So here we have for 2 decades what was happening. So you see in the period 1998 to 1991 what they had before and what they had after, and you see there was not happening very much in this decade. So on the province level it is very randomly distributed. In the 90s, where we had this construction boom phase, you see that most of the provinces ended up with having a higher share of for-profit housing 10 years later. So we see economy-wide, also on the regional level, that these boom phases affect the shares. And our prediction for the current phase would be, because high interest rates and for-profit companies have actually left the housing market, at least in new construction, we would expect that the momentum shifts back in favor of the non-profit housing associations over the next 10 years. So that would be our prediction, simply because the boom in housing is over. And econometrically, we try now to answer what are the effects of these shifts on rents. If there are questions about our approach and the data, I can answer now, or we can talk later. I will not talk about the methods in detail here. I will present you the results, and what we see, this is the key result maybe of the study. So we see here plotted for different shares of non-profit GBV, limited profit housing associations, for different shares of them compared to the private market. So 0 would be we have no non-profit housing, 50 would be we have an equal share of non-profit to for-profit housing in the region, and 100 would be a market that is only full with non-profit housing associations. And here what you see is the markup that I was talking about before. So we see on average, I think nationwide, the share is somewhere here at 50%, below 50%. We have roughly €2 markup that comparable private units are more expensive than non-profit units. As soon as we start to increase the share of non-profit housing associations in the region, we see actually that the difference evaporates. We see that at least this is how we see the channel, that the competition channel erodes profits in the regions where non-profit housing has a considerable share of the rental housing market. we also invested the results a bit, tried to identify tipping points. So if we estimate the whole thing a bit more flexible, we do not assume a linear relationship between the two. What we see is quite interesting, actually, that for low shares of non-profit housing, we actually see very little effect. So if you have very little social housing and you increase social housing, you will have very little dampening effect on the for-profit market, which sounds reasonable. Actually, only after we reach a threshold of 50%, so there are the same amount of units for-profit, unregulated, and non-profit units, we see what was happening before, that actually the markups decrease with the share of the non-profit units. So this is not to say that you should not build non-profit housing here because it does not help you to dampen for-profit rents. Actually here, for the people and the tenants living in the non-profit housing units, their advantage compared to the market rents is highest. But if we think about shaping markets and maybe affecting larger shares of the market and also the for-profit sector, you can only achieve an effect once you reach a certain threshold. At least this is what our results are telling us. So this is my almost last slide. Yes, so I've shown you the results. I think a big question always when it comes to the Austrian model is what does it cost? This is the typical question that I get, and actually comparisons are quite difficult because countries have very different systems of financing and everything. And to be sure, it costs taxpayer money. But from what we could see in those two projects I talked about initially, actually, it seems like a good investment. So it reduces the amounts of subsidies to low-income households, the share of which is very, very low in Austria. So other countries have different approaches to affordability. But at least in Austria, it seems that we can economize on how much money we have to give in terms of direct transfers to households to achieve housing affordability. We did an input-output analysis also to understand the economy-wide effects. So if you look at what happens through the non-profit housing, it actually shifts resources from high-income landlords towards more construction investment and economy-wide consumption expenditures. Also, this does not come priceless. So the high-income landlords, they pay taxes. So we have tax shortfalls. So we tried to take this into consideration. Also, the non-profit housing associations, they get tax exemptions for corporate taxes. So, but even if you take all that into account, it still seems like a good investment from what we see. And I will stop here. I just took some time yesterday to produce this graph because right now in Austria the discussion is not only about housing, but it's a lot about the breakdown of new construction in housing. And and now all the construction companies are looking to non-profit housing companies because they hope that they will be the customers over the next 10 years because they're used to it. And so one other argument for the Austrian system is not so much in the sector of housing itself, but that it stabilizes actually demand in the construction sector. So instead of the boom-bust cycles that we've seen with very large downfalls in a bust phase, if you compare the deviation of the two segments of the private segment here in blue from their long year average. So we have bust phase, we had a boom, we have a bust phase, and now we had this incredible boom. And now this is going down to somewhere here. So the non-profit associations are a stable force in the construction sector. So I think this should also be taken into account to see housing as part of the economy and the ramifications such a system has for the economy wider. So thank you.
Well, thank you for this excellent introduction. And I think what you describe is something I think that we need to explain again and again. So it's not strictly private, it's not strictly public, it's a third way in a way. So it's the private entities, but that are working on a limited profit basis. And you take it for granted here in Austria because it's your way of working already for a long part of your history. However, this is something I think that is not common in many parts of Europe, and it's I think it's one of the points which is growing in interest in many cities and many countries, because they are looking for a way, as you say, to shape their housing markets, not to leave only purely to market forces, but to shape. And having this third way can be a way to shape housing markets, which makes economic sense, as you pointed out, social sense, and also environmental sense. So I think, as you pointed out, very different to evaluate different systems. And I think there's multiple academics all over Europe working constantly to evaluate. And you pointed out how difficult it is to evaluate with a single indicator. Is it value for money? Is it cost effective? Because this is a little bit the issue. We have to broaden this to the societal impact. And that's what makes this complicated. It's long term, and we're talking not about a strictly speaking value for money in this year, but value for money in terms of societal payback. And I think this is what makes the housing question so complex, but also so fascinating in a way. So thank you so much for giving us that introduction. To show indeed the impact on the private sector, but also the resilience in times of bust and boom of the sector. And crucially, the last point you made, the point about resilience of the construction sector. I mean, this is something we saw in 2008. The construction sector really flattened in many countries, but in the countries with a strong limited profit, public or social sector, we saw if they had scale, they were able to support that other key part of our economy.